Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to you guys today. It's kind of funny for me because when we did this talk last year, and actually it was last spring term, we were worried about sequestration, and and there wasn't a lot of talk about anybody kind of going the contracting route or talking to consulting firms. And in fact, in some corners of this building, and you guys know this, and Dean Crocker knows it better than anybody, contracting is kind of a dirty word. But I'm here to disabuse you of that a little bit, and I'll try to do that today. I'd appreciate it if, despite the fact that we've got a large number of you here today, that we look at this as a dialogue, very informal. I'm going to give you a little bit about me. I want to get a little bit about you. We won't do what we did last year and go around and get everybody's name, but I want to get some profile information from you. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about these things. So I'm going to give you a little bit, as I said in introduction, I want to talk to you about what's contracted, and we'll play that game. And unfortunately, and I did the same thing that I did last time, so if you attended this, keep it to yourself. And I'm afraid that the things that were surprises last year won't be this year because of a lot of the news items. We'll talk a little bit about the industry at large. I'll give you a couple of facts that you may or may not be aware of in terms of the scope and the magnitude and the diversity of federal contracting. We'll talk about some of the players. I'll give you Jim's competitive segmentation schema for federal contractors and how I think about them. We'll talk about trade associations and what they do and why they might be important to you if you're thinking about going this route. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of again, from my vantage point, the kind of the state of the market as somebody that works with federal contractors now and not the federal government. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what's in it for you as it relates to this contracting as a field. What I'd like to do is break the conversation up kind of like this, and it doesn't have to be a process-looking thing. You don't have to just listen to me for the first half, and then we have a conversation in the second half. Just as you do in class, or hopefully as you do in class. Let's talk about things as they come up, and things hit your mind. Interrupt me, please, and we'll just have a dialogue. So a little bit about me. Matt said I'm class of '83. I have an undergraduate in finance. I did a couple of things before I went to work for what was then called Arthur Andersen & Co., and I worked in the Management Information Consulting Division, and nobody in the world knew what the heck that was, least of all me, and it was one of those jobs I could never explain to my parents. But I had it, and I had it for 27 years in a firm that became then known as Andersen Consulting and later known as Accenture, and all of that stuff worked out extremely well, and I retired from there almost exactly 2 years ago in September 2011 after a really long career. And I took about a year off, and then some people started coming after me, and I finally said, all right, look, I'll come to work for you, but I'm not going to work for you. I'll take a paycheck in the form of some consulting fees, and I'll do a little bit of work. So I, under the form of a company, Nextesse, I do some work for a couple of firms in town, some government contractors, some private sector firms that do a little work for the federal sector, and all I do is corporate strategy work. I don't help them write proposals. I don't help them decide whether they should bid on something. I do corporate strategy and some merger and acquisition stuff. I'm married to an Aggie for a very long time now. I have an Aggie son here, class of '15, whoop, and looking forward to him getting off of my payroll as my daughter did this year, graduating from Rice. We live in Annapolis, Maryland, and we spend a good part of the fall here in College Station. We have a place here. We go to football games. I come and spend time with students here, and some things. I do some work in the Bush School, or in the Mays School as well. I chair the MBA advisory board over there. Help them raise funds and teach a couple of classes at the graduate level on corporate strategy of all things. Go figure. I like to sail. I actually live on a Chesapeake, on a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. I have a sailboat in the backyard. It's my favorite thing in the world to do. Do a couple of other interesting kind of things. I'm into gear, sports. I'm a typical guy. The more gear there is, the more interested in it I am. And I've been coming back to this campus literally since the day I graduated. And you see people like me all the time around here, and it's one of the unique things about Texas A&M. So let's talk about what gets contracted for. Who can find for me the one item on here or the two items on here that the government does not contract to the private sector to do? Guesses? We had prizes last year for this. We don't this year, but that's all right. I'll buy lunch. Anyone? Wild guess. Yes, sir.
Weapons system design, paramilitary ops.
Okay. Wrong. Next. Wrong. Next. Yes, sir.
Policy making?
Nope.
Security clearance.
Oh, you haven't been reading the paper very much lately. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Intel analysis.
No. You haven't been reading the paper either. Turns out all of these things are contracted for by the federal government. Anybody heard of a guy by the name of Edward Snowden? There was a private sector firm that does about 70% of all federal security clearance vetting that is in really deep trouble right now because of Edward Snowden and the whole thing that happened around him. But yeah, the fact of the matter is it's very difficult to policy making. I'll give you a half a point for that one. But there are a tremendous number of firms that do work. My firm, as a matter of fact, me personally, where you get engaged with the government to assist in policy making. You don't make the policy per se, that's a federal prerogative, but you do a whole lot of homework behind that to understand, well, let's talk about a set of scenarios. What happens if we go this way versus that way? What are the underlying economics? What are the underlying impacts to society or to our relationship with Russia or what have you? There are firms that do that every day of the week. There are firms that do all of this stuff, and frankly, the list of things that are contracted for within the federal space, of things that are not inherently government functions, important term of art, are very frequently contracted for. So the interesting kind of so what for you in this is things that you might be thinking about doing today from a go into the government and do it standpoint. There's a reasonable probability that you can do that very same thing or something very close to it or in support of that in the private sector, working for an Accenture or somebody like that. It's an enormous marketplace, about $500 billion a year, plus or minus, in services work. So this isn't paying for ships. It's not paying for the F-35. It's not paying for things that go bang. It's not paying for computer hardware. This is hours of people's time. And it's about 15%, give or take, of the budget. And it is in all, virtually every kind of category you can think of, ranging from, R&D kinds of work down to IT and professional services run the gamut. There are a lot of contracts out there that are called professional services that, you can decide whether they're professional services or not. But again, point being, any place that you might want to work, any agency in which you might want to do business, chances are very good they're letting contracts for support. There are a lot of reasons why they might do that. Dean Crocker and I were talking just a couple of minutes before we got started here about our mutual view that the wave of outsourcing certain jobs to the private sector is here to stay. There are a lot of very good reasons to do it. There are a lot of very bad reasons to do it, but in large part, it frankly helps the government move a little bit more quickly in a lot of ways, and quickly frequently translates to less expensively. If you can, rather than stand up an agency to get something done, maybe I can stand up leadership around that agency, and maybe I can bring in some quick private sector support who maybe know a little bit more about whatever it is we want to do. Say we want to build a system. I'll give you an example. Who here has heard, or better yet, who here has gone through U.S. Visit? Who knows what U.S. Visit is? Any foreign students here? I know you went through U.S. Visit. Non-U.S. citizens in the room? You guys went through U.S. Visit. You had to. And what that is essentially, so when you're not a U.S. citizen and you cross the U.S. border anywhere coming into the United States, you have had to have applied along with your visa application through U.S. Visit, which is part of Department of Homeland Security, put down your 10 fingerprints, give them a picture, you know, all your biographical data, and it basically gets attached to your visa and your passport. And every time a non-U.S. citizen comes into the United States, you verify with biometrics that you are who you say you are, and that you are who your passport says you are. Why do we do that? We did that now because of what happened in 9/11. That was a program that was kind of sort of underway at the time that 9/11 occurred, and got ramped up on steroids immediately afterwards. I ran that program for 5 years as the lead contract program manager. At the time that I was there, which was sort of 2005 through 2009, we had about 600 contract people working to build and maintain and augment and kind of supercharge this system that worked in about 300 different ports of entry, give or take. You probably know that number off the top of your head. You know, checking people every time, foreigners coming into the United States, making sure they were who they said they were, and so on, and other things. That system was stood up quickly and advanced quickly because the government didn't have to try to hire into the government a bunch of people who were experts in biometrics, experts in certain kinds of technical architecture, experts in process management, and the kinds of things that are very readily available out in the private sector that the government could buy, scale up quickly when they needed it, and ramp it back down, which has been going on for the last couple of years, when they don't need it. It's very difficult to get rid of a federal employee. As anyone who's ever worked in the federal government, or really probably any government agency, will attest to. When you're there, you're there. If you're a contractor, we end the contract, and you're gone. And it works pretty quickly, and that is one of the reasons that contracting, one of the other reasons that contracting actually makes sense for the government. Now, I can scale up, I can scale down, I can do it pretty quickly. And when you look at the lifetime cost of something like a U.S. visit, the ability to do that with that kind of speed, with a level of expertise, with a level of flexibility, ends up being cheaper for the taxpayer than it might have been if I had to stand up that entire agency. By the way, when we had 600 people on contract, I want to say the number of U.S. visit personnel in that 5-year period I ran it never exceeded 100 people that were government employees, who dealt with the policy, who did some of the intel analysis behind it, who did some of the questionable vetting and what have you. So it was, and that you couldn't have stood that up with the same level of quality and speed and so forth if you hadn't done it on a contract basis. So that's a little bit of the why. Questions so far? You guys are just letting me talk, and I have a bad feeling it's because our room is so large here. All right. Anybody in this room that's been a contractor to any government agency, federal, local, state? What did you do? What can you say that you did?
I worked for Health and Human Services on Medicare field.
Okay. Who was your employee or employer?
STGI.
Okay. I know STGI. No one else? Any other former government employees? Who were you with?
Postal Service.
Excellent. You, sir?
I work for the Agricultural Research Service in acquisitions.
Okay. So you know all about this. You come up here and I'll sit down. There are a lot of different players in this marketplace. And you know, when I worked as the part of my background I didn't give you, so I did 17 years with Accenture as a strategy and general management consultant to the financial services industry, which means I flew around the world and talked to bank CEOs for a long time about all kinds of interesting stuff, and it was great, but I flew around the world all the time and I never saw my family. And so right after 9/11, I was looking for a transition of some kind that would allow me to live and work in the same town. And lo and behold, Accenture had sort of a reasonably decent federal contracting business, and I was a partner at the time, and we were able to cut a deal that I go over there and live and work in the same town. The government does not. This is a benefit of being a government contractor. Typically, the government does not like to fly contractor personnel from point A to point B. They like you to live and work where you're working, and that's actually a really nice thing. So then I spent 10 years working to build from that one fledgling U.S. visit contract a business that focused on the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of State, transportation, energy, and the EPA, and I left there. It was a $300 million business with about 1,000 employees. And so I had a lot of time, you know, as a guy operating a large business to think about my competitive set. And so you'll have to forgive some of the terminology here, but just to lighten it up a little bit, this is the way I used to think about my competitors. You know, we always thought about the metal benders, you know, because they were always the big guys. They have all the contracts. That's Lockheed Martin, it's General Dynamics, it's Northrop Grumman, and it's others, and they're the people that, you know, you may be more familiar with in terms of, you know, planes, trains, and automobiles, or tanks and Humvees and MRAPs, or whatever, you know, pick your flavor. But they also do a tremendous amount of consulting work. Lockheed does more IT work, I believe, than anybody else for the federal government, which might be interesting to you. They also put people in harm's way who carry guns. There are, you know, the hardcore technology propeller head type companies like a Verizon. You know, IBM's in there a little bit because IBM sells gear as well as they do people. You know, Cisco Systems, AT&T, you know, companies that sell tech widgets, and there are tons of them, fit into that category. There are organizations like the Chertoff Group. Everybody is familiar with former Secretary of Homeland Security, Chertoff, who was in that chair when I was doing the work at US Visit. He has a very interesting team that he's formed of some very senior former government officials that work to do two things. They advise on policy matters quite frequently and regularly, but they also work as an investment bank. And they seed funds to different companies that want to do work for the federal government, might have an interesting technology and what have you, and they've actually in the last 2 years kind of moved into somewhere between there, and they probably actually have their own segment, because I don't know anybody else right now that does what they do kind of the way they do it. They're about half ex Goldman Sachs people and half ex, you know, somebody with secretary in their title, in their former title. They're a very interesting firm. There are a number of, you know, think tanks. You guys are very familiar with the CSIS group and RANDS and Council on Foreign Relations and the like. There are what I call the formers. Companies like Booz Allen Hamilton and SAIC are famous and excellent at becoming the next career for lots of former federal government employees, and they're usually taking very senior people on. I'll bet you had offers from Booz, at least Booz. And they're, you know, Accenture always had a very difficult time making that work. That firm has a very different model. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Booz and SAIC were excellent at that. They still are excellent at that. Small businesses. So whether if you're, let's see, if you are doing systems integration type work, you can be a small business if your average revenues over a 3-year period are 25 million or less. And if you're not doing IT kinds of work, it has to be 15 million or less. There are, I don't remember the last count, but I know it's over 5,000 small businesses working to contract to the federal government. My client is one of them. And, you know, mostly formed by two kinds of organizations. They are well, actually three. They're going to be people who left one of these other firms because they wanted to do it their way. There are going to be people who were retired senior government officials who had a way to do something better. My current client fits into that example. There are people who have invented a technology of some kind, and that might be well suited to the federal government, and they form a company around that. If you're a small business trying to contract to the federal government, in many, if not most, agencies and departments, you get a tremendous amount of extra special treatment. The government wants to see small businesses thrive. You had experience with that, I'm sure. I was working, selling work just within the last 3 years when I was right before I retired to the Department of Energy. Department of Energy, all the departments in the federal government actually get they get metrics on and goals for supporting small businesses, other types of disadvantaged businesses, women-owned, hub zone headquartered, minority-owned, disabled veterans, and so on. and energy might still be so upside down that they were putting $500 million contracts out as small business set-aside contracts, meaning the small business had to be the prime contractor, the lead company on the team, and had to get 51% of the business. I want you to think about that for a little while you're pondering these numbers, and sometimes that's how it works, and that's a lot of advantage. Gets guys, companies like Accenture, when I was working, to subcontract to large firms or to small firms that get these deals. Groups I call privates with a conscience. So, companies like Accenture, IBM, you could put some of the tech companies in there, get the vast majority of their revenue from private sector work. They're working for JP Morgan Chase, they're working for United Airlines. They might be, they could be working for individuals with extreme wealth, but they're doing work for the government. I can tell you, Accenture did work for the federal government of the United States and federal governments across the world, mainly for a couple of reasons. One, they felt like it was their duty. We're running around solving major problems, doing so in very, very creative ways. Frequently in ways that are 4, 5, 10 years ahead of what different government agencies are doing for things that are very, very similar. Is there an opportunity for Accenture or for an IBM to bring that into the government and help the government operate more effectively? And that's one of the reasons. The other reason Accenture did it, and I know from close friends at IBM, and I'm sure many other large firms are the same way, there was a sense that if these were firms that have pretty substantial investments in government relations arms, how can I hope to be influential to the federal government when I'm not playing a role in trying to make things better? So it all came back to trying to make things better. But and that's why I say with a conscience, and I know Accenture was serious about that. I mean, you could look at it too. There's kind of a portfolio aspect. Any portfolio theorists in the room? You guys are they're all at the May School. But being in the government business in 2007, 8, and 9 was the best place you could possibly be, because while the entire world free market economy was on fire, practically every developed country in the world was putting money into contracts to keep things going. And so while the private sector was falling apart, the public sector was doing pretty well. And then the last group, well, not quite the last group. I run into some firms every once in a while, private equity firms that like to invest in firms that do business. They have an interesting tech and they're trying to do business with the Defense Department, or they're trying to do business in the intel community. And believe it or not, they're out there, and there are a lot of rich people out there that want to be kind of close to that kind of stuff, and that's how they get close to it. They buy firms that are doing the work. And then lastly, there are the FFRDCs, federally funded research and development corporations, which, like MITRE, there are several others. I know MITRE the best because they were the primary FFRDC for Homeland Security and Justice, and I think State too, while I was around. And they operate kind of in the middle space, which is sort of interesting. Any former FFRDC personnel in the room? Yeah, I don't think so. They're an interesting place to think about and to investigate. They operate in the space between the pure private sector and between the federal government. They're funded by the government. Sometimes they actually compete against private sector firms for contracts, but they get some special treatment. They get some special access. Again, back to the U.S. Visit thing. We worked side by side with the MITRE team at U.S. Visit. The MITRE team, because they fit in kind of that middle area, sat in the office space of the federal employee, had infinitely better access to the federal employees than we did, and we, the pure private sector contractors, had to have our own separate walled off office space. Part of the rules of operating in that environment sometimes. What I'd ask you to write down and at your convenience take a look at. Washington Technology is kind of a local area of Washington, D.C. trade rag, if you will, focused on mainly the audience is government executives who contract to IT providers and other technology providers to the federal government, as well as the contractors themselves. If you're ever interested in getting a lot of detail about this topic, a tremendous amount of detail about the 100 largest companies that do business in this space, just Google Washington Tech 100. And every year they rank order based on revenues that get reported to the federal government, which is reasonably accurate. Who the main players are, the links to who, to those companies' websites and so forth, and you can have an opportunity to learn a lot about them. If you're kind of a mind that when you get out of here, you want an opportunity to, maybe broaden your horizon a little bit as it relates to potential employers, that's a really good place to go. You'll see who's out there, you'll see what they do. It doesn't do a very good job of sort of segmenting them for you in terms of these guys do IT, these guys do strategy and policy, these guys, take guns and go into horrible places. You'll have to do that homework on your own, but you'll find a lot of the names in there are names that you would recognize from other exposure. So it's a great resource. Let me take another time out. Questions? I'm going to ask you guys some questions. Anybody had any exposure to government trade associations? Any members? This is another interesting place for you to go. A buddy of mine actually had his son go work at the Center for Strategic International Studies as a high school. I think he did it as a high school junior and as a high school senior before taking an admission to Vanderbilt. And they are in the middle of DC think tank focused on an extremely wide variety of policy issues. It's a very interesting place to go and to look. And anybody searched any of the websites of the think tanks and the trade associations? You guys are missing out big. I'm 100% certain that at least from the second row back, 90% of you in every one of those rows has a reason to do that related to your coursework. They publish a wealth of studies on virtually any kind of topic, and this is, I'm kind of federal centric, so forgive me for that. About any topic you can imagine related to what the federal government is doing, what they're thinking about, what they should be doing, how they should relate to the private sector, how they should relate to the citizenry, how they should relate to other government agencies, how they should relate to the private sector businesses. What sort of relationship should we have with Russia? What should we do about, the next Edward Snowden? There are incredibly bright people with multiple decades of experience, and many of them with PhDs, genning out a tremendous amount of work on all of these topics. When you're either a government employee or a contractor working, in or around DC and doing stuff on behalf of the federal government, you end up getting involved with these agencies because these trade associations, because they're not only a tremendous wealth of the kind of people I've just described, but they're a forum for bringing people together. They bring together competing companies who are focused on working on some of the same stuff, which when I was in the private sector struck me as really weird. Why do I want to talk to those guys? I used to make money when I was selling strategy consulting to large banks by being the smartest person in the world on X, whatever X was. If we were re-engineering, in the probably in the kind of the early 90s, that was what I was the smartest guy in the world about. If we were doing bank mergers and acquisitions and consolidations and the ability to do that, I was the smartest guy on that. If we were doing e-commerce, and this will be totally foreign to you, there was a time when nobody but universities and the Defense Department had access to the internet. Can you imagine what that was like? There was a time where we built strategy to figure out, help banks and frankly every company in the world figure out how they were going to make money on the internet. That wasn't obvious back then in kind of the mid to late 90s. So we would never talk to the competitive set about that. We would not get together and ask questions. There were no teams. I never teamed with IBM on anything in my life, or McKinsey. I always went head-to-head with McKinsey. I was proud as hell that I was 5-0-1 against McKinsey, and the only reason I had a tie was because the client had a relationship with them and they forced us to work together, which was a big mistake. But in the government world, the government likes teams. The government likes to spread stuff around. We talked about the small business aspect. They want you to bring to the party, to any particular contract that you have, the absolute best people on every aspect of whatever it is that you're doing. And so while in the private sector, a big deal, to, let's say we were going to re-engineer the corporate bank of, JP Morgan Chase, soup to nuts, that whole deal might be $50 million, and that might take 2 years, and that would include a strategy component, and that would include some technology work and resorting the staff out and changing the organization and all this stuff, and we'd get it done in no time. Like scope for, I don't know, let's say Department of Education Federal Student Aid, which is a very large bank. That like scope is probably $500 million, and it's going to take 5+ years, and it's going to take hundreds of people to do the work because the standards are different, the ability to make decisions quickly is different, and so on. The scope is huge, and the federal government wants a belly button, a company, if you will, that is the world-class, smartest organization in the world on originating the loan. And we want one that's different on documenting the loan. And we want one that's different on figuring out how the loan's going to get paid. We want one that's different on figuring out what the technical architecture of all of that is going to be, and so on. So you get teams. Well, you going to the various and sundry many times a year kind of trade shows that these organizations put on help you connect with those other firms that do that stuff, and you build relationships. When you live and work in DC, and you guys have heard this a million times from your profs, from your friends, from your other employers that you may have had, from your parents, the relationships that you have are gold, and that is nowhere more important than it is if you're working in or around a government organization, and you can build those relationships here. So anyway, I've bored you to death on that. Millions of good reasons to go out there. Do yourself a favor when you leave this room. Google one of these. Go take a look at their website. See what's out there. Look at the think tanks. Look at the trade organizations. It'll blow your mind. They're also, by the way, terrific sources of employment. Matt, do you know if you guys placed anybody with any of the trades?
Probably not initially, but I know we've had people that have gone to trade associations after they've been in DC for a little bit of time.
Yeah, I would think so. The other thing that's interesting about them, which I failed to mention, and it's actually one of the biggest reasons that contractors get involved with these, is the organizations frequently, they're sort of viewed as a neutral party. I mean, as it relates to doing business with a government entity, these guys are Switzerland, which is great, and they can get very senior government people to attend their functions, very senior contract people to attend those functions, and those people can kind of collaborate in a risk-free environment. My friend in the very back of the room, when I'm done, will give a 2-hour lecture on the federal acquisition regulation and all of the pain and drama associated with contractor relations with federal employees. We don't have time for that here today, and frankly, it's not that much fun. But suffice it to say, you got to have an honest broker in the room when you're going to have a conversation about something that the government's going to buy, and these guys do a terrific job of doing that and giving you an opportunity to have that conversation, which otherwise doesn't happen. How are we doing on time? How much time do I have, by the way? 1:25. Okay, beautiful. I'm late. What's going on? Do you guys spend a lot of time talking about what the state of the federal government is in the United States and the budget and all that stuff? You talked about sequestration until you're ready to vomit. Yeah. Okay, so we won't have to talk about that. What's the view? Who thinks sequestration is a bad thing? Nobody? Couple? So the rest of you think it's a good thing? Hands, good thing? How many of you have no opinion? All right, you should be embarrassed. This is the way elections work in the United States, and then you have to be sorry. Now I'm going to talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. So it's so a little bit on what I'm doing these days. So I mentioned to you that I went to work for this company. This is Jim's quick lesson on negotiating a contract. I had an opportunity to, I told you about this, I had an opportunity to enter the government in a very senior position, and I turned it down, which, there are people that would say I'm a traitor for doing it, but it wasn't right. The timing was terrible. I just left Accenture, and I couldn't have done it. And if I couldn't have done it and been happy with it, then the government wouldn't have been happy with it. Take that to the bank. So later on, and I still wasn't quite ready to do this, but a buddy of mine who was an extremely senior official in one of the Justice Department agencies came to me and said, hey, we want you to come on and be our strategy guy and our COO and all this stuff. And I said, no, let's have lunch. Well, we talked, and he finally talked me into it, because first of all, I love what he used to do and what he does today and what their firm does, which they do some very interesting and very unique stuff for DoD and for the intel community. And so he said, I'll tell you what, I'll go to work for you if we can do it the following ways. I'll work as a contractor to you, as a consultant, but I'm not going to work on any of your deals, period. I'm never going to work more than 2 days a week for you, because I'm not working right now. I don't want to. And I get infinite schedule flexibility, and I can leave anytime I want to without any notice whatsoever. And you have to pay me X, and he agreed to that, which I was certain he wouldn't. But so now I'm stuck, and I've been working with these guys for a year. But anyway, so they're interesting. They fit into the small business category barely, and the work that they do, I would broadly characterize as in the security industry, across a wide value chain of what that might be. They don't put people in the field carrying weapons, other than for that individual's personal protection. And they're in all the worst places in the world. They're in some of your favorite places, actually. And they do strange and interesting things, most of which are classified. That said, they were dealing with this sequestration issue. They were dealing with the issue of, we're about to cross the threshold of getting into, going from being a small business where I've got killer tremendous advantages to going into what in the federal contracting world is kind of contractor no man's land, which is, when you cross the small business threshold and they no longer look at you that way, but you're too small to have the sort of, corporate oomph and girth and capability to be able to take on the big deals. That's where a lot of businesses fail. What are we going to do? Can we make it just doing what we do? So we've spent a lot of time on these topics. They're very worried, as are many federal contractors, about what's going on in the Middle East and other places that we don't talk about a lot, where there's actual, honest to God, armed conflict, which generates. And I didn't do any work around any DoD stuff when I was working for Accenture, but it blew my mind how much actual support there is to have people in theater someplace. It's mind-boggling. What all the stuff you see on the news is a tenth of really what's going on, if that much. And so there are a tremendous number of people that are supporting that. A lot of contractors are supporting what's going on. That has nothing to do with carrying a weapon, but it might have to do with making sure we know where people are and that they get where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be, and that that they're as protected as they can be, and things like that. And so contractors are worried about that. Sequestration continues to be an overhang out there. And it's an overhang on federal employees, although some are getting a little bit of relief, in terms of, okay, well, you guys can now decide how you're going to deal with your 10% cut, as opposed to just taking it across the board, which was the walking in the door position. And maybe you guys can do that too, but that's not true for everybody yet. And the first place they go is they go to the contracting community and they go, you, gone, see ya, have a nice day. And just limp along and try to get it done. Contractors are always going to take it first, rightfully so. That goes back to one of the advantages of contracting that we talked about earlier, is the ability to shut it down, move it off, and do it really fast, like days, sometimes hours. You all right?
Yes, sir.
So we spent a lot of time talking about that. State of the Affordable Care Act. My client doesn't worry about that because they're not going to do anything in the healthcare world. But I know that's been healthcare and contracting to the federal government, DoD and civilian related to healthcare has been gigantic business for the last several years, even prior to the passage of Obamacare, because the government and private sector are trying to move healthcare into the 21st century. Wouldn't it be great if every time you walked into a medical facility, boom, they can pull up your health history, and you're not having to fill out those 5 stinking forms every time you go to a doctor's appointment, sometimes even for the same doctor that you've seen for the last 40 years. It's really amazing, and the federal government's trying to do that. And it's actually more important in my mind for the federal government, because again, I think about defense, I think about State Department, I think about agencies that send people all over the world all the time. It's really hard to keep track of that stuff. So that's been, what's going on with that is really impacting the contractor community. Cybersecurity. We spent a lot of time with my client talking about cybersecurity. What's the difference between cybersecurity and physical security? Anybody? Got to be somebody thinking about that. Yes, sir.
Security on information networks, computers, mainframes.
Do you have is there a physical component to that too, though?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you could use a cybersecurity attack to overload something.
Yeah, and vice versa. I mean, you can take down. Would it be a cybersecurity attack to put some C4 around a server farm? Maybe. They're the same. It was fascinating. I spent a lot of time studying that topic as it related to my client, because they thought they might want to think about it. I thought they were nuts. And after spending some time building value chains for the two, they are the same. You're just working in sort of a different environment. But if you don't think about this as mystical and computers, software, and and circuitry, and if you just think about it as a filing cabinet, or you think about it as a place you really want to protect because the family jewels are there, now all of a sudden it's kind of the same. Different people, different skills maybe, but they need to be thought of kind of the same way. That's enormous. I haven't found a company yet of any size that doesn't say that they're in the cybersecurity business. Everybody is. Nobody knows what that means. There's no common definition for cybersecurity either, by the way, which is kind of cool. It's the Wild West. It's kind of the internet of the 21st century as it relates to, kind of mega trends and change that are destabilizing frankly, to both the business and government. And I'm not talking about attacks. I'm just talking about, kind of discontinuous change that you take a look at and go, how in the heck are we going to respond to that? Contractors are going crazy, falling all over each other, and the government trying to figure out how to solve for that. That's a really interesting field. Contractors took a lot of anticipatory actions. They fired a lot of people in the spring. When I was having conversations over here back in, I think, February, we were talking about the fact that the contracting community had started letting go a lot of people. And I think the week I was here, Lockheed Martin announced that they had let go like 8,000 people, in and around Bethesda, Maryland, which sort of has a material impact on the economy. And they're still holding tight right now. There's still some hiring going on, but it's very targeted. Guess where all the hiring is right now? Anyone? I just told you what it was. Cybersecurity, exactly. Here's a fun fact for you. Sorry about this, but everyone is going to leave this room, quit the school, and they're going to go join the comp sci. They're going to get masters in cybersecurity. Commonly accepted metric right now is that there are 30% more jobs in the United States, federal and private sector, in cybersecurity than there are qualified people to fill them. That should tell you what's going on with the salaries in that world. We've talked about most of the rest of that, and government's going to continue to furlough. So not just as it relates to sequestration, that creates the furlough environment where there are a tremendous number of government employees, many of whom, probably most of whom, frankly, that can't really afford for this to happen, that have to take off a day every other week, and that's a material impact. I live near Washington, D.C., and I can tell you the cost of living in and around Washington, D.C. for a lot of federal employees who work there and don't want to drive 3 hours each way, it's got to be at least 3 times what it costs to live in Bryan College Station, Texas, at least. And that's if you have roommates. It's crazy. So at the same time that the sequestration thing is going on, I blew past the top bullet, which is, we just went through the last battle between the administration and Congress on the budget. That shut everything down for a couple of weeks, and you guys probably saw all that press. Contractors, for the most part, still got paid, while the federal employees weren't. They weren't getting paid by the government at that point, and as a contractor employer, you were writing checks that you knew you weren't going to get any recovery on to your employees, but you had to keep them. So those people still got paid. They couldn't go to work. They couldn't use any of their government equipment. They couldn't walk in the building in most cases unless you were, essential personnel. But they still got paid. That's not the reason to become a contractor, by the way, because hopefully this doesn't happen as often as it has been lately. You've talked about that. Why wouldn't you want to do this? I've spent a tremendous amount of time talking about why being a contractor was kind of a good and fun thing, and frankly, I enjoyed it, and I will do my time in the government. I guarantee you. That's a promise. And I'll take a couple of years and I'll try to get one thing done. I feel like if you can get one thing done in a couple of years in the federal government, you've just hit it out of the park. I will do that one day. I really enjoyed my time. I felt like I actually served this country. I didn't feel like I was going to think that when I walked in. But when I think about the hours put in, the impact I was able to personally have on the government, on the security of the United States, on energy policy, on cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, on a wide variety of different things, on completely restructuring Customs and Border Protection. I served the country. I'm proud of it. I got paid a hell of a lot more than anybody I worked with by a mile. But that's because I was a really, really senior guy. Most people, it won't be quite that case. And I had the ability to do a lot of different things and to move around. And I was going to be at this agency for a period of time, and then either my usefulness or the contract's usefulness or whatever was going to end, and I would go move over here. And that's one of the kind of the interesting things about working as a contractor. We'll come back to that later. So you guys tricked me and you got me back onto the positives. It's a really good thing. The downsides, I was never in the big room. I would be walking with the director of Pick Your Agency, and we'd be talking about this, that, and the other thing. And he'd walk into the big room with the all the flags and the cool table and important people, and I got stopped at the door. I never got to go into the big room. I never got to ride an Apache helicopter. I really never got to see the final policy until it actually went out. There was a lot of I never got to brief the president. Although if I had taken that job, they said I would have. But those are the kinds of things that you never got to really do. You were always sort of close to what was going on, but never really right there. That, by the way, is a hazard of a consultant's life, period. Even in the private sector world. You'll always be very close. You'll always be, the wizard behind the curtain. The great and powerful Oz. You'll always be back there, and no one will ever know who you are if you're lucky. And that's a good thing, by the way. You don't get the federal benefits package. I had no retirement. I had to save my own retirement. Thank God, I was extremely lucky. But it was always a little weird from that perspective, and that's one of the things that made me commit to the fact that at the right point in time for the right opportunity, I will jump into the government and do some work, because it is the one place where you can have kind of the final impact, which you don't get to have that as the contractor, and that I think for how many of you does that sound important? How many of you came here because you wanted to have huge impact? Why did the rest of you come here? Okay. Was that movie Accepted? Have you ever seen that movie? Yeah. Why did you come? So let's get back to the good things, because I want to spend more time on the good things. The bad things at the end of the day aren't that bad, unless you're dedicated to having a big time hand in something that's going to happen. And oh, by the way, if you want to see it through from beginning to end. That was the other thing that always sort of, if you ask, geez, Jim, what were your regrets in your career? My biggest single regret was I never got the opportunity to see a thing, whatever that was, a merger, the birthing of a brand spanking new business, whatever. I did a ton of different stuff. If you can name it, I probably did it. Never got to see it from beginning to end. Got to see it from beginning to here, or from this point to there, or from that point to there, but never all the way across. You won't get that as a contractor typically. You won't get it as a consultant in the private sector. You will get that. You will get that as a government employee. So last few words on this. It is another entry point into public service. There are people of these halls that we talked about that will debate whether contracting to the federal government, a state, local government is public service. I happen to be of the school that gosh darn right it is. Because I will tell you, as a contractor, it is so dang hard to work for a government agency because of guys like you, Mr. Procurement. No, because the way it is. It's just the way it is. There are tremendous rules. They're there for good reasons. The government government employees are under such incredible scrutiny, it's mind-boggling. If I learned to appreciate nothing more about the people I worked with across the table, it was the amount of scrutiny that they were under. If you work in the private sector and you're trying to get something done for another private sector company, and I consulted on this all the time, I think it's called the Pareto principle, where you're always trying to work to solve kind of the 80%. If I solve the 80%, it's taken me 20% of the time and I get it done. And then the problem set changes dramatically at the end of that. Now I'm working with a completely different 80%. And I'm going to move from this 80% of the problem, which takes me 20% of the money to finish, to the next 80% of the problem, which takes me 20% of the cost to finish. In the government world, I have to be 100% all the time. And my board of directors is the Congress of the United States of America. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just going to let that sink in for a few moments. I got to be 100%. I got to be accountable to the Congress. And they're a group of people that have a hard time sort of agreeing with one another very much, ever, and especially lately. How do you answer 100% of the needs of an organization that can't agree with itself on what to do? That's the environment in which the federal employee lives and works every day. And so they have to keep arm's distance from the contractor. It can be kind of a tough environment. This gives you another point to go in and to do the kind of work that you want to do. It's hard. It's really, really hard to do. You will get exposed probably to more things more quickly because of what I talked about earlier, the ability and the opportunity to work in this part of a particular program until your bit of it is done, and then to move on to this part. Well, this part over here is probably going to be at a different agency, and it's probably going to be a different program because you picked up some very interesting skills over here in what? Cybersecurity, and you moved from over here. And you're working on that in this agency. So I moved from the DEA, and now I'm working at Department of Education, and then tomorrow I'm going to be working at the Department of the Interior on something else. You'll get a chance to see a lot of different stuff. I got into consulting because I thought it would be a good way to interview for jobs elsewhere, and I was never good enough to go to another company, so I stayed at Accenture for 27 years. But you have an opportunity to see what different agencies do, and that I found hugely fun as a contractor, the ability to move around. You will be, and people might disagree with me, and it varies from place to place. But in the main, and in my personal experience, and the experience of many people who I worked with on that side of the desk, you will find a slightly higher caliber of individual in the contracting world. They have different standards. They can hire and fire. They can say, and which we did, about every year we're going to go through and we're going to look at the bottom 5 to 10%, and we're going to say there's something else that you probably ought to be doing because it ain't working out for you here. You can constantly cull the herd and constantly upskill your team. It's very, very, very difficult to do that in a government agency. You got who you got. You might be able to move some people from job to job and so on and so forth, but you kind of have who you have. This is like think about whatever sport you like to play, where you're in competition with another individual or a team. Don't you always play that game better when your competition is better than you? You always do. You'll develop more quickly outside the federal space. You will have a more challenging peer set. You will have a greater opportunity for more rapid economic rewards and higher rewards on the top end over time. You will be responsible for your own retirement. So don't look for that to come. There is this point I'm actually a little wishy-washy on. I'm personally biased to it, to there being tremendous career development opportunities because of my background with Accenture, who spends close to $1 billion a year on training for its employees at all levels of the organization. And I know IBM does that. I know many other firms do that. There are a tremendous number of firms that don't. There are a tremendous number of government agencies who actually do that and do that extremely well, and there are about as many that do that terribly. Your former agency actually is one that does it exceedingly well, but I can point to many others. I don't know. I'm not going to name names if this is on camera, but there are a lot that don't, and they know who they are. And lastly, there's a very interesting opportunity that would not come as frequently from working directly in the public sector, and that would be the potential to off-ramp to some other business just working in the private sector, doing something similar to what you did in the public sector. And I'm not talking about going from Accenture to SAIC just to do more work from the government. I'm talking about going to work from Accenture Federal Services to Accenture Financial Services and doing cybersecurity for banks. I'm just kidding about that, by the way. I hope you know. But the ability to move, should you decide, at some point in your career, and you may decide that or you may not, that I've done the government thing, I've served the public, I've done it for 25 years, I'd like to go try something else for a little while. Or the other thing that a lot of people have done that I've seen, and frankly I've counseled a number of people to do this, go do 3 to 5 years serving the public sector, stop, go do 2 years serving the private sector, and then come back and serve the public sector and see the amount of growth and change your perspective. Different lenses are hugely valuable. You have the opportunity to do that. Frankly, in the government, you can have the opportunity to do that sometimes. We've taken some exchange employees. Defense has a killer program where they'll take senior people and move them into private sector companies for a period of time. I don't know if state ever did that. But I know DOD does that quite a lot, and increasingly so. But so that's another option for you. I'm done talking. Yes, sir.
I have a question. When you say, certain contractors can serve as a good entry point into certain government agencies,
Yes.
is there a trend in that? Who tends to be more or less hostile to, moving contractors into their organization?
I haven't found any hostility to that anywhere. It's going to vary from place to place. But I've watched and aided people. I lost 10 people who did really well on the foreign service exam, and we moved them into state, and they work at the State Department now. We've lost people, civilian jobs at the Pentagon. Everywhere. Department of Education, I lost a bunch of people who were really, really incredibly focused on the mission. I can only speak from my point of view, and my point of view is, again, it's kind of that Accenture point of view, and everybody the place hired, we felt were the top 10% of everybody in the world, period. And the government loves those people. You can't get enough really good, smart, dedicated people who are willing to jump from that sort of environment that they came from into the public sector environment and take the bet. So I never saw a problem with that. It would be very difficult, not impossible because I've seen this too, but it'd be difficult for you to work 5 years at an Accenture, or let's call it 10 to 15, and get a little closer to middle age and then want to become an FBI agent or something like that. But it's not impossible. Good question. Others? Stump me, I dare you. Yes, sir.
Sir, I would make the argument too that contractors, some would make the argument contractors are simply an extension of certain congressional or administrative agendas because they sit outside looking in. How do you combat the argument that you're just an extension of some kind of political agenda for people?
Extension of the political agenda. I'd probably say maybe you are, but I don't take the term political agenda as necessarily a negative. So Congress makes the budget, the president spends it, right? And all the agencies. So you're going to be working as a contractor, you're going to be working for one of the myriad, agencies under the administration of the executive office of the president someplace. You're serving the president's political agenda, you know, and whatever the policy is of the administration at the time that you're working in there, you're going to be doing it. You are an extension of that. Here's what you're not going to be doing. If the supposition was you're going to be sort of a, you know, kind of a hatchet team for you know, somebody's private political agenda to go in and get something done, I haven't seen that. I suppose it's a possibility, but again, you know, federal acquisition regulation lecture coming on after this is done. There are a tremendous number of controls in place, of supervision, of you know, oversight, triple oversight, to make sure that, number one, if you're going to hire contractors, it's going to be for a valid and legitimate reason that gets approved, inspected, signed off on, budget set, you know, oversight before you even get the RFP, the request for proposal, out on the street. It'd be really difficult, but you are always serving the agenda of the president. And what's really fun is when you're working on a particular program, and it's as fun, probably actually maybe more fun for the contractor than it is for the government person, and I mean that tongue firmly planted in my cheek, when the administration changes. When you go from, say, I don't know, a Bush administration to an Obama administration, and you're working on a contract, and those policies, you know, go 180 on you. Yes, ma'am.
Do you find that companies like Accenture are hiring generalists or specialists in something such as cybersecurity?
Both. Yeah, it depends. Did everybody hear that question? So, yeah, I think I will tell you, in cases of the private sector firms with a conscience, you know, so the Accentures and the IBMs and the Deloittes and the CSCs and, you know, and those kinds of firms that do work on both sides of the house but are mainly private sector focused, a lot of those firms are looking for, you know, entry level, they're looking for raw talent. You know, have you got a track record that says you've done some stuff? You came to the Bush School, you graduated high in your class, and oh, by the way, before that, you know, you were an entrepreneur and you solved cybersecurity, or you were an Olympic athlete, or you know, those kinds of things, right? But you did something, and they're gonna hire that person every day of the week, regardless of what you know. I hired those people all the time. I can teach you cybersecurity. I can't teach innate ability to drive hard and get stuff done all the time and lead people and have the attitude and persuade. That's very difficult. They also want that expertise in whatever it is. And so the other firms tend to lean that way. Of the other firms we talked about, they'd like you to have 20 years at the Department of Transportation, you know, working on solar cars, and they want that. But the more generalist firms will take both. Do I have time for one more, or do we got to cut it off? Thanks for your time and attention.